Welcome to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where Peter Madison and David Sharrock discuss the complexities of adopting new ways of working at scale. Hello, Dave. How are you today?
Peter, doing very well. Good to catch up. Good to have a bit of a conversation. We had a plan, right? So we're going to do a small little topic, MVPs, lean startup, and see where that one goes.
Yeah, we started there when we were sort of warming up for this conversation, and we landed on the rather famous phrase of all models are wrong and some are useful by George Box, who's a British statistician. But I always like to pull that one out, especially when it's I run into over application of a particular model without necessarily thinking that, is this the right place to apply this model? Is there a better way to do this?
Well, it's interesting. I find that we use models a lot. We talk about different models. Think of I think I was going to say flavor of the month type of model, but we use models a lot in our work because while, to the quote, they're all wrong, but they can be valuable at a particular point. I think one of the things that's probably pretty clear is that for the most part, we don't have one or two favorite models that we just are hungry for different models in different scenarios.
Yeah, for sure. And part of the reason is, I mean, we use models because they're simplifications of the complex world that we live in. And as a consequence of being simplifications, you're leaving out some information. It's just the nature of it being a model. That's what it is. And so yeah, that means that's where the original statement came from. It was like it's the simplification, so therefore it can never be perfectly accurate to represent the system.
Well, and I find that kind of part of where this came from is both of us are beginning to see comments around the lean startup being passé. It's something that people want to move away from. And certainly both of us have spent, I would say, quite a bit of our career talking and using the lean startup in very specific context. And neither of us, I think, have fully bought into the idea that somehow we need to throw away this concept of the lean startup, minimum viable product, various other sort of concepts that come with that, just because certain things have changed. Coding is much easier today than it 15 years ago.
Yeah, I think perhaps that some of the problems that people have encountered when following that methodology may be that they've not necessarily adopted everything that's in there. But I mean, one of the common comments that I've seen on it is that incremental improvement from a base. Like I create my MVP, I put it out there, I get feedback, I increment from there, and I continue to increment from there to improve. Where people are saying, well, that's not enough, that's incomplete, it's not enough. I have these step changes where something major happens, or I realize this isn't the right direction, I need to pivot. And if I'm continuing just to increment in the same direction, I never talk about that piece as well.
Which I always, so there's a couple of things that jump in immediately to mind. One of them being, as you're describing it in that way, I know early on in the implementation of the lean startup and minimum viable products, it was actually about those pivots, those significant shifts away from the direction. In fact, Eric Ries talks about how they used it to pivot away from a gaming platform to one that's based around the avatars chat, various things like this. So there are significant pivots kind of embedded into how minimum viable products were used in the early days. I think at the same time, now more and more it's used as is this feature going to work? So let's validate feature by feature or small bits of functionality at a time, which is much more in terms of that incremental.
Yeah, so there's this piece right there where we need to be considering what is the purpose of this next thing that I'm going to build, but also, am I every once in a while or going back and checking that this is taking me in the right direction at all? Do I need to make a major change in a different direction? And then there's lots of examples of this in terms of understanding, well, what's coming down the pipe that might cause me to need to make a major change into the way that I do things. Am I entirely in the wrong space, the wrong business, that I need to rethink entirely what it is that we do and take this somewhere else?
Well, as you're describing that, it's making me think I think there's a big difference between strategy and making predictions based on where we are right now and what we have around us, and that sort of strategic thinking of, is there an opportunity for us to angle towards various things like that? And I don't think we'd think of lean startup as a strategy.
No, we think of it as it's an operational effectiveness tool. It's like how do we effectively go and find other direction? How do we effectively learn the next thing that we need to do to understand how do we move forward? And that idea of creating a system which is continually learning, continually looking at what is the next thing I should try, that makes a lot of sense.
For sure. Now, what would you say you have seen change in recent years around lean startup and minimum viable product?
Well, one thing, I mean, for sure, especially in the last few years, it's become much, much easier to try something, to create a new direction idea. If there's a myriad of AI tools out there, take something like Replit or something like that, where you could just, hey, I want to try this idea, build it. It'll come up, it'll set all different agents off for you, and it'll create something which you can then even push out on that platform to try it out and see if this works. This does what I want it to do. So experimentation becomes much easier.
Yeah.
That's a small scale, and in large organizations, I can start to do similar pieces. I have less reliance on waiting for an engineering team to be available to
Yeah.
build this thing for me so that I can then go and try and see if this is the right direction to recommend that we take things.
So, I mean, what I hear you saying, I mean, I think of it as commoditization of the actual development of an idea, which, again, if you think back to minimum viable product concepts, we would often use paper prototypes, Figma mockups, various things like that to validate ideas because they were cheap and easy to pull together. And the development of those apps or services, whatever it might be, was more difficult. Well, that's getting easier and easier to do. So I don't need necessarily to use a Figma mockup. It's nearly the same amount of effort for me to just build an app and that uses that Figma design and actually interact with it in a more meaningful way. So that's the commoditization of development, which really just pushes the decision further along the line. You're closer to a working product, or at least a potentially um, working product, let me say it that way, than you are when you're looking at Figma designs.
Yeah. Now, of course, Figma would be very upset to hear you not talking about their Dev AI
Of course.
capabilities, which will take that design and automatically create the solution based on that design. And all of
I
your
said it was
UX
easy. I
design,
said it was easy. You can even do it inside Figma, of course, right?
you can even do
But
it inside Figma. Yeah,
the interesting thing about that is I don't think that invalidates the lean startup and minimum viable product. It makes it easier. It makes it more accessible to many more people. So people who are trying to get startups off the ground can do these things much more quickly and get kind of more perhaps meaningful feedback more quickly. But to your point, it's very much along that incremental, how do I make something easier and easier to use?
yeah, and actually, and that ease of use is an interesting piece too, because one of the things I have noticed with these, along with these prototypes, is that they don't necessarily produce good user experience in amongst all of the other things that they're doing. I mean, the very simple pieces, oh, it's a website form or something that you fill in. Yeah, okay. Again, that's fairly straightforward, but for when you start to get into more complex systems, more complex interfaces, they run into some of the same challenges and thinking about who's going to be using this, how are they going to use it, which parts of this are most critical are still elements that you need to do. And you can go ask another AI or say
Yeah,
how that might
it's
work.
circular at some point, doesn't it? So
It does, right? Yeah.
I just wanted to touch on, I think there's another use case perhaps around lean startup, which is misuse of minimum viable products, lean startup, and that thing, pivoting and so on. And we've seen that, we've talked about it before in terms of the term, people talk about pivoting all the time. They talk about minimum viable product, which are months and months in preparation, which goes against this concept of minimum viable product. But I think one of the things that I don't think you can talk about the impact of the lean startup without recognizing that, like many great ideas, they get picked up and then just not followed through
Yeah.
to its entirety. It's very easy to do the stuff that we like, but not do the stuff that takes more discipline, that requires a little bit more thought and more effort. And therefore we're doing something that we're going to call the lean startup, but we're not really understanding or following through on the pieces that make it the
And some of that, I think, is being available to have the feedback. So
yeah.
your feedback loops are actually creating change in the product to actually improve the product. And if that feedback loop is incomplete, or you don't have a solid way of looking at that and then building out in the right directions. And this, I think, goes back to the other piece that don't just focus on the feedback, because if I ask my customers, they'll want faster horses. I also need to be looking at where is
Yeah.
where's the car? Like, well, what point do I need to build a car? Right? It's that
Well,
conceptual idea.
I'm just even thinking, are we even asking the right people, right? Are we getting in the opinion, the behavior of a cohort that isn't our target customer, isn't going to have it, doesn't have the problem we're particularly aiming to solve, right?
That's
So,
the Nike problem we talked about a few
yes.
episodes back. Right? It's the if you only listen to the noisiest customers, then and the noisiest customers are going to be the ones who have the biggest complaints. But they could very well you could end up going down to a niche and suddenly finding that well you don't actually have an audience anymore and you've shut down all the pieces that you really needed. So
Yeah. Now, if we, as I think we're kind of not buying into the lean startup no longer being relevant, it's a model that has its place. You also talked about it being a really good tool model for incremental change, for incremental learning, small changes as we kind of direct towards a desired outcome, which I think is we're on the same page there. Like big step changes, where do you look for that? Anything that jumps to mind?
and we touched on this earlier on around the strategy piece of it is from a leadership perspective, are we re-looking at our strategy? Are we making sure that on a regular basis we're going back and we're observing what's happening outside as well as inside the organization to understand what might need to change? Are we still going in the right direction? If we continue down this path, is it going to take us towards the outcomes we're looking for? Do we need to make changes? Are there, and that those step changes can come in lots of different forms and ways, of course. The problem often tends to be once we've set off in a particular direction, are we flexible enough to be able to change to a new direction? And do we have mechanisms in place to allow that to happen at the right points in time? Because sometimes it can be, well, we set off in a particular direction to learn something, but we need some time to learn whether this was the right thing to do or not. And there's that
Which
piece.
sounds like you're dovetailing into, say, business model canvas coupled with lean startup, and now all of a sudden you're back at the beginning of that incremental learning journey.
Yeah, something there has to be a trigger. There has to be a trigger.
Yeah, it's so one. I mean, we're in a world now where the natural response in a lot of cases is to go and ask large language models and start really trying to fine tune where that might go. I'd say we've had some mixed results with that one, mainly because one of the interesting things in a strategic perspective is to look at the extreme, the
Yes.
outline, and what you often end up, at least if you're not forming the prompts in a smart way, you end up in the middle ground rather than looking at the extremes. So you're missing these key opportunities. And one I still come back to a tool that I think hasn't had enough recognition, and that's Wardley mapping
Mm-hmm.
for shifting the thinking. I find the construction of Wardley maps to be a convolute. It's a lot of effort to go and really think it through for your particular area. However, the thinking the understanding that comes from that about where opportunities are coming from, about things which are really out of view, like outside the radar of an organization, but could really come in and impact their area, the domain is so interesting. And so I still kind of, when I think of that step change perspective, I kind of come back to probably my favorite tool there is, that doesn't work everywhere, like we've just said, but that favorite model is the Wardley mapping structure.
Yeah, I agree. It is very valuable. I've used it on a number of occasions, even in a group setting, although it is somewhat of an individual sort
Yeah.
of exercise to put it together. But in a group setting can be valuable just to help, especially a senior leadership team, understand the commoditization of elements of their delivery system. Like, here's my value chain. Here are the elements of my value chain. They are slowly commoditized over time. So now if we start to understand that, what's the impact on
Yeah.
the system, where do we need to focus our energy?
Well, and I mean, all the noise about how various kind of types of work are becoming open to attack or replacement through agentic AI and various other generative AI solutions. When you start thinking about the pace of that change, I feel that Wardley mapping really helps you kind of tease out some of those areas and look at what happens if you really do commoditize in these areas where we've got a lot of investment as an organization, very possible.
Yes, yeah. It's the commoditization of knowledge work and delivery work is essentially what that targets, and it has a massive effect. Another space where I've seen impact on what you were describing earlier around just going to the large language model is in things like architecture decision records as a mechanism to communicate or to capture major decisions.
Yep.
And if you just go and ask the large language model, what it creates naturally will drive you towards the middle, which means you are going to miss out on like what are the consequences of that, because it's also very positive generally. It's like, no, that's a great idea. Yeah, you totally should just upgrade every single one of your systems overnight. Yeah,
I thought that was just me that it thought was a really, really smart individual coming up with some great ideas.
Sorry to burst your bubble, but
yeah. How do we wrap things up?
Well, I can come up with a couple of points. I think one of the main ones is I think it's very true that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And we've talked about some useful model. Lean Startup is still a useful model, but it is important that it doesn't exist in isolation and that it's used well in the organization where it's most applicable. And the tools that it gives you, like the business model canvas and a lot of the other pieces, are very valuable, very useful, can help you think through problems. So use them. I think Wardley Maps is another key model that is also very, very useful and can help you identify where a strategy might be and point you in the right direction, especially if you marry it with all of the other pieces that fit into that. Spend some time learning about it. And Sam Wardley's put a whole ton of great posts on Medium that you can use for that. What would you add to that?
So as you're describing it, here's what strikes me really clearly is you need multiple models. And what we've talked about really is the concept of I need continuous incremental change, innovation testing, hypotheses testing, and so on. But you also need to be looking at those sort of bigger step changes.
Yes.
So in the particular, that context is I think at different times organizations are going to focus more on one than the other. But the reality is they need both capabilities within their organization. I think that really, that concept of balance, and we've often talked about, more of one thing, less of another, and so on. How do you get that balance? The other thing that struck me as we're going through, and I think we've talked a lot about AI and little popping up, and what strikes me in this conversation is how pervasive it is in terms of where to go for ideas and how to work with it. And it's really peppered through our whole conversation without it being we're just going to talk thing, which I think just shows how rapidly we're shifting into that sort of paradigm where it's at the table and driving a lot of our conversations and provides a lot of commoditization insert.
Yeah, it's another tool in the toolbox and another critical part of practically every system that you're going to encounter these days. So, Awesome. Well, thank you as always, Dave. Always good to have these conversations, and I look forward to the next one.
Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. You've been listening to Definitely Maybe Agile, the podcast where your hosts, Peter Madison and David Sharrock, focus on the art and science of digital, agile, and DevOps at scale.